Thank you, Mr. Pachori. Thank you, Dr. Khosla, for inviting me. I feel a little bit like an interloper because I had warned Dr. Khosla that I perhaps know the least on the subject with specific regards to Jammu and Kashmir. And as a researcher, it's my job to be upfront about my own limitations. But given the topic, I was requested to talk about the broader risks and opportunities and how we might be able to learn from what's happening within the country and outside in a very stressed natural resource environment, and what lessons from there could be applied to Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. So I am going to, although this is focused on mapping out the resources, and I'm quite certain that the speakers on the panel will be able to give you the specific tools by which to go about doing that, whether it's natural or physical or human. I wanted to take you to the complete other extreme of what happens when things go terribly wrong with regards to a changing climate, especially in a very vulnerable area. And unless we keep that in mind, any kind of resource mapping that is static for today will not suffice for the developmental solutions that we design for the future. So let's start with just understanding what are we as a species doing to the planet and what is the planet likely to do to us. Globally, we are well on track for well over 3 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial era. Now, it seems like 3 degrees is something we are very comfortable with. We manage with far greater ranges in just a city like Delhi. So what's the problem? The problem is this is an average. And when we start looking at specific regions, especially say high altitude regions, then those averages don't help us, don't guide us very well. We already know, just in the last 2 months, that India has actually now climbed up to number 5 from number 14 in just 1 year, from 2017 to 2018, to being one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. So in 2017, we were number 14. By 2018 data, we're number 5. We also know that on a high emissions pathway, and this I'm quoting from my book on climate risks, the incidence of extreme drought affecting cropland could increase by 50% in South Asia over the course of the century. The incidence of a 30-year flood becomes 3 times more frequent in a river like the Indus and 6 times more frequent in a river like the Ganga over the course of the century on a high emissions pathway. So when we have these broader understanding of what's happening globally, how vulnerable India is and how bad it could get for India as a whole, how should we then start thinking about how could Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh get affected? Again, from research that has already been published, not just from my institution, many others, this region has already surpassed the world average temperature rise of about 0.8 to 0.9 degrees Celsius. This region has already recorded 1.2 degrees Celsius rise above pre-industrial era. So we are talking about a region that is vulnerable because it is actually, the curve is of a different measure than what the globe is facing as a whole. The region has also shown a rising trend in extreme warm events over the past 5 or 6 decades, a falling trend of extreme cold events, and a rising trend of extreme values and frequencies of temperature-based indices. And this is data from ICIMOD. The region is vulnerable to climate change because it poses serious threats to agriculture, horticulture, water resources, tourism, many of the issues that we were discussing in the previous panel, habitats, forests, and wildlife. There are about 250,000 hectares being used in the region for wheat cultivation, 210,000 for maize, 110,000 for rice. All these get affected by even minor variations in temperature, let alone on with regards to water availability. The deficit in food production in the Kashmir region alone has reached 40%, while the deficit for vegetable production has reached 30%. So when you add to that the vulnerabilities that we're talking about, we're looking at a far bigger problem. Now, the question that was posed by Mr. Pachauri and for the panel is, if we know certain things, what do we not know? And this is also where we'll have to do a lot more mapping. So, Mr. Ramadurai, who also happens to sit on the board of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, knows this sort of parable, but I'm going to say it to you. Imagine a frog that is boiling in a pot of water. Right? And the frog calls his science advisor and says, feeling a little warm. Yeah. What's going to happen? And the science advisor says, well, in the next 5 minutes, the temperature is likely to rise by about 5 degrees, plus or minus 1 degree. So this is, and the science advisor is not wrong. In fact, the science advisor must give a range. There is no absolute certainty. So the frog carries on. But what if the frog changed the question and said, I'm feeling a little warm here. What is the worst that could happen? The science advisor would then say, well, the worst that could happen is that you will boil to death. In 10 minutes' time, it will become unbearable for you to be sitting here. And if you still manage to hang on, it will take just a few more minutes before you boil to death. Now, the reason I say this is that the way we frame the question will determine the way we map the resources. General Sullivan of the US Army said on the battlefield, and I'm looking at a former soldier, on the battlefield, we prepare for the worst and then we hope for the best. And at CEEW, a few years ago, we had organized a war game dealing with climate risks, involving generals, admirals, scientists, diplomats from many countries, to exactly understand, once we start posing the question how bad it could get, then what are the questions we should be asking in terms of resource mapping. So let's keep that in mind now. What do we not know? We know, for instance, from ICIMOD, through its Hindu Kush Himalayan region program, that extensive research is being carried out in the region. But downscaled models, downscaled data models for Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh are still missing. And what do we mean by downscale? It means you have high resolution analysis to be able to have incisive decision-making tools. We also know from the UN Disaster Risk and Recovery Report that the Kashmir floods also stated that the scale of the damage in the Kashmir floods could have been averted if proper regional and transboundary early warning systems had been functional. Again, we were referring to early warning in the earlier panel. The Ministry of Earth Sciences has launched the Integrated Himalayan Meteorology Program. Maybe some of the panelists here are involved with it, which has installed high-end automatic weather monitoring stations. Now, in 2017, there were just 27 such stations. This has now increased to 43. But you can see that basically the number of stations that we now have are still very few for the size of the region that we're talking about. And based on long-term data collection, then only you will be able to do long-term forecasting or scenarios. So the sooner we start collecting the baseline data, the faster we will be able to at least have some reasonable ranges of estimation. Finally, we have very little scientific data on the extent of climate change that is already occurring in the region. DRDO's Snow and Avalanche Study Establishment has begun work in this area through its program called Him Parivartan, but a lot more has to be done. So we know on average things are going to get bad. We know on average things are going to get pretty bad for India. We know on average Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh is actually ahead of the curve, and that's in this regard is not a good thing. And we now know there are still a lot of baseline information at a high resolution that we don't have. Which brings me to the final bit that I wanted to say. How could we then communicate these risks better? Because no political leader or policymaker is now going to wait for another 15 years before all the information comes through. So, the number one thing we have to communicate, as I said earlier as well, and I'll reiterate, is start collecting the high resolution baseline data yesterday. We got to start it immediately. So if Mr. Pachauri is saying in a few weeks' time there's going to be a delegation going forward, this has to be number one message. Right? Number two message, and this came up in the previous panel, so maybe I'm just repeating. What we don't have in terms of scientific measures, we have in terms of community learning. Whether it was in terms of the shepherds that Mr. Ravi Singh was referring to, or many others, in terms of traditional knowledge. Let's start a program, if it doesn't already exist, and I'm confessing my ignorance, of quickly mapping resources or reserves or traditional knowledge in the region. Right? So on one hand, we're establishing the monitoring stations for baseline measurement. On the other hand, beginning to map and codify the traditional knowledge that exists. The third thing we'll have to do is establish a process, and I will reserve my judgment on what is the best institution under the current political configuration of the region where that can be done, but establish a process for regular, biennial climate risk assessments. Means every 2 years, there is to be an update on this. And you do it in 3 ways. Apply the principles of risk assessment. Means you're assessing risks with regards to your objectives. So it's not just general risk. If my objective is horticulture development, then I have to map the risks against that. If my objective is tourism development, then I have to map the risks against that. What do we basically wish to avoid? Identify your biggest risks and the worst case scenarios, consider the full range of probabilities, and then take a holistic view. Second, broaden the participation to do this risk assessment. Of course, scientists and researchers will be needed. And of course, for instance, the institutions that already have data, or if there are public sector enterprises there that already have data, have to be included. But we also have to include, as I mentioned earlier, communities. We have to include sociologists, anthropologists, a range of different actors that come together to have a better understanding of risk assessment. And finally, report this to the highest decision-making authorities in the region, whatever they are today or whatever they might evolve into tomorrow. So I'm going to conclude. I know I've perhaps taken the 10 minutes that you could have used to learn specifically about the region, but I've confessed my ignorance, but I'm bringing to you the basic message that this region we know is vulnerable, but we don't know how much. So let's get that basic information going, because without that, any decision we take today will not suffice even for a 10-year horizon, let alone the century. Thank you.